May of 1864, Cartersville was besieged by hostile forces, occupied by the Union Army. Their interest in Cartersville was the railroad that divided her and the conveniences her homes and businesses and churches could provide them. Those that served some purpose were preserved, and the rest destroyed. This residence on North Irwin Street was the home of Elijah and Cornelia Field during the occupation. Overtaken by federal troops, it was used as a post office during the war. In 1864, this structure was the Baptist Church. Federal troops occupied it and stole brick to construct officers' quarters. In 1889, the federal government paid $5,000 to compensate for the damage it inflicted on the church during the war. This, known as the Wofford House, survived the war with little damage. While the construction date is unknown, it is known to have been purchased by John Satterfield in the late 1840s, and certainly is one of the oldest structures in Cartersville.
Hello. Last week, the history of Bartow County followed the movement of the Union and federal troops from Kingston to Cassville, and set the stage for the exit of the action from Bartow County by showing General Johnston retreating the Confederate troops across the Etowah River, and General Sherman's Union Army moving off to the west end of the county. And so we'll pick it up there this week, again with Bob White, with the action that occurred around the Stylesboro area.
Thank you, Ellen. Let's review for a moment the disposition of the troops, as Ellen pointed out. General Johnston had retreated safely across the Etowah River, and by May the 20th, all his forces were safely there, Hood's corps being deployed along the river. Johnston's headquarters was at Stegoff, now Emerson, Polk's at Altoona, and Hardy's corps a little behind over at a place called Wilford Mill on Pumpkin Vine Creek. General Johnston was uncertain as to what move General Sherman was going to make at that time, so he more or less remained inactive, except he did have cavalry divisions, General Wheeler's cavalry covering the Etowah River toward Canton, and General Jackson's division of cavalry from the Etowah River via Stylesboro toward Hardin Bridge and toward Rome, for some distance upstream and downstream. The positions of the Union Army at that time was as follows. General Cox, who had pursued Johnston to the river, and there shelled the Confederate Army as they retreated across the Etowah River, were positioned at Cartersville and at Cass Station. And the 23rd Army, Cox's division, sent 2 regiments to destroy the ironworks at Cooper's. And they had considerable trouble in getting up the river road on the opposite side of the river from which Hood's troops were positioned, as troops from Hood's corps fired into them. And they finally had to give up that route towards the ironworks and go by a circuitous route and come in on the opposite side to destroy the ironworks.
Bob, could I interrupt you right there? Refresh our memories of the significance of what was going on at the Cooper's Iron Works and why that was a strategic.
The Cooper's Iron Works was a large complex of furnaces that furnished ordnance for the Confederate Army. They made cannon and tested cannonballs, and the records state that they fired into the opposite hill to test the cannon and ordnance that they'd made there. They were also getting ready to make pistols. As in possession of the Cooper family today, they have 2 Colt 36 caliber pistols made from iron, which was refined at Cooper's and sent to England. And evidently Cooper had in mind some plans to manufacture the Colt pistols. But there wasn't extensive ordnance work. They made railroad iron, spikes, and with a corn mill, flour mill, and was a pretty good sized village. Population of about 2,000, of which about 500 worked in the ironworks proper.
And that the village of Etowah is now under Lake Altoona.
Yes, a lot of it is. The only thing remaining is the old furnace stack below the dam. The 23rd Army Corps were camped at Cartersville, and they occupied Cartersville, and the depot and the area right around the Methodist Church was used as a campsite. Also, part of this force was camped near Hillside Drive in Cartersville, and they were in firm possession of the town. And also part of this corps was camped at what we know as Cass Station, which burnt, I think, in 1969, but was there during the Civil War and used as a storehouse for the 23rd Schofield's Corps, as well as the Cartersville Depot. The Army of the Cumberland under General Thomas, which was the main or central force of the Union Army, was stationed between Kingston and Cassville. And this was the center column, and the right column of the Army was General McPherson's Army of the Tennessee, whom we have already seen had previously captured Willie's Bridge and had access across the Etowah, and they were camped at the mouth of Conosina Creek. And on May the 22nd, General Sherman issued orders after equipping his 3 main units of his army with abundant supplies of ammunition and rations for a movement away from the railroad, because he knew that had he pursued Johnson into the Altoona Hills, he was familiar with the terrain and his forces would have been cut to pieces. Accordingly, on May the 22nd, General Sherman issued orders for the 20th Army Corps, the Army of the Cumberland, to move southward toward U-Harleyville, and it was called, is U-Harley now, but during the Civil War was called U-Harleyville and Stylesboro. The 23rd Army Corps, which was stationed in this vicinity, was to move southward from Cartersville and Cass Station via the Burnt Hickory Road and the Chulio Road as we know it now, past Etowah Cliffs, and then to move via the Milam's Bridge. And Stoneman's cavalry was on the flank of the Army of the Ohio and crossed at Shellman's Ford to cover the laying of 2 pontoon bridges. The reason for that is the Confederate cavalry had burnt Milam's Bridge. On May the 23rd, the Army of the Ohio, as I mentioned, moved from Cartersville towards the bridge. And when they arrived at the bridge, they found that General Joe Hooker, who we know was kind of tempted to get the jump on everybody else, instead of moving toward Kingston, he took the pontoon bridges that were already laid down for the Army of the Ohio and was completely out of position because his order specified that he was not to cross there, that he was to go and cross down at Gillham's, or what we know as Hardin's Bridge now. And he upstaged the whole unit of the Army of the Ohio, and they had to delay for a whole day in getting across the Etowah River. And meanwhile, the 20th Army Corps, the Army of the Cumberland, the center column, with General Sherman accompanying, moved from Gillham's or Hardin's Bridge as we know it on the same day. All movements of the federal armies had cavalry units that covered their advance. The cavalry division of General McCook moved in advance of the 20th Corps with Sherman accompanying. And at Stylesboro, McCook met the resistance from the cavalry forces of W.H. Jackson's division of cavalry, consisting of the brigades of Lawrence Ross, which is Texas troops, and the Alabama brigade of General Morgan, of which he belonged to General Martin's division of Wheeler's Corps, and was kind of out of position, but the Morgan's brigade had been fighting with General Ross all the way from Resaca toward Rome and in Kingston. So General Wheeler left this brigade to assist General Ross. And with the Morgan's Alabama Brigade was my great-grandfather, Benjamin R. Turner. It was this unit who stopped General McCook and forced the Federal forces to withdraw for the night. The Confederate armies on May the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd kind of remained quiet. General Johnson didn't know which way Sherman was going to move. So he, on the 23rd, ordered General Wheeler to take his cavalry division and move in on towards Cassville to find out what was happening. And of course we found out previously that these units had already moved out, and delaying at around Cass Station was a large wagon train, supply train for General Schofield's 23rd Army Corps. And General Wheeler carried out a diversionary attack on Cartersville to kind of draw the attention from the Federal cavalry away from it. And with his main unit hit the wagon train, which was near Cassville. That was General Schofield's complete wagon train, and completely destroyed a number of wagons, and the records state that he brought off 80 loaded wagons and also 180 prisoners, with the remaining wagon trains being burnt. So we pick up now with Sherman moving into the Stylesboro area via Gillham's Bridge and Hardin Bridge, and also a portion of the Army of the Cumberland moved across what is known as Island Ford. This was an old post office and was after the Civil War, but roads no longer exist going to Island Ford, but it was an island in the river, which was easily accessible by on each side, and could be easily crossed.
Now tell us again where Islands Ford was.
Pardon?
Tell us again where Islands Ford was.
Island Ford was between Gillham's Bridge and Willis Bridge.
Okay.
Actually about halfway on the Etowah River. As we see, General Schofield was to cross at Milam Bridge, and accordingly, the stonemen covered the movement of the pontoons, and he finally did get across the river. These units converged on Stylesboro. The Army of the Tennessee, General McPherson, was west of Stylesboro and was around the area of Macedonia Church and was not exactly in the action at Stylesboro. General Sherman was a little bit concerned about the crossing of the 23rd Army Corps, the Army of the Ohio, at Milam Bridge. And he, being a mile or so distant from that, wanted to check on the progress of General Schofield across the river. And therefore he rode eastward on some rather small roads to check on the progress of the Army of the Ohio. From there, the armies progressed toward Burnt Hickory Ridge. They moved out over roads which are no longer in existence, via behind the Stylesboro Academy, straight in towards the Burnt Hickory range of hills or mountain. But prior to that, at Stylesboro, before we get too far in advance, the Stylesboro Academy was spared by General Sherman for several different reasons. One of them being the motto inside the building, for God and country, which is written in Latin and still exists today and is untouched and has not been painted. Also, on May the 22nd, they had a communication to the Army Department of the Cumberland that there had been entirely too much looting and burning of houses and taking of possessions, and it was stated that the taking of property is useless to the Army and even to the individual, is most destructive to discipline, and is in fact giving a premium to worthlessness. as the good soldier passes where the straggler and worthless man stops. The burning of buildings, unless done by order from competent authority, will be severely punished. And it's for this reason, I believe, that a lot of the homes in the Stylesboro area were spared. But the depot, the academy, had a very useful part in Sherman's plan. You must remember that all of his supplies and the main supplies for his army was at Kingston Depot. And when he cut away from the railroad, being west of the railroad, it was necessary to move these supplies via wagon trains, and they had to be pulled by mule teams. And of course, the old mules couldn't go so far, and they had to be changed at various points called relay points. And it was for this purpose that General Sherman, I think, ordered the academy spared. And the reason that I reached that conclusion was that the ladies at the Stylesboro Improvement Club called my attention to the fact that some of the benches had notches where they were used as feed troughs. Mm-hmm. And immediately I began to put two and two together and to come up with an answer that indeed that was a very long supply line. It's from Kingston through Stylesboro and then on to Burnt Hickory. And that for that reason, as well as the previous statement that was directed to Sherman about useless burning of property, was incidental in saving very many homes there.
Mm-hmm. Briefly, if you would, explain to us the history of the Stylesboro Academy itself.
Okay, the Stylesboro Academy the construction was started, I believe, in 1858 and dedicated in 1859. And this was not the first academy at Stylesboro. Previously there was one located east of where the present structure was that quickly became too small to accommodate the expanding population. Mm-hmm.
Would it have been within sight of the present Stylesboro?
It would have been within sight of the present Stylesboro, about a quarter of a mile from the present site. Also, there was some activity around Raccoon Creek Church before Sherman left the Stylesboro area. It was fighting. The original church was across the Raccoon Creek from where the present church is. And it was in that area that my great-grandfather was fighting, opposing General Sherman's forces.
What was the magnitude of the battle at Raccoon Creek?
Well, it enabled the Confederates to slow up the advance of the Union Army somewhat. Usually, those actions were usually a rear guard action, just designed to kind of slow the progress of the troops. Mm-hmm. And from there, those units moved. The Army of the Ohio had moved by Raccoon Creek, Richland Creek, and it spared the Lucas House, which is the Fountain Taylor House, and moved on into the Burnt Hickory Ridge range up the creek. Of course, they had to have water. Water was almost mandatory for the men and for the mules that were with the armies.
The Lucas House, what was it used for?
The Lucas House was a large plantation known as Clarendon, mm-hmm. and was owned by Major W.H. Lucas.
But why do you think the Federal Army spared it necessarily? Did it serve any purpose to the...
The Lucas House did not, but I think this directive that I had just read on May the 22nd had a lot of impact, and this was directed to Sherman about the useless burning of homes. They took everything that would be of use to the Confederacy, but a lot of those bummers, as they were called, would go into a home and take personal possessions and jewelry and anything that a lot of it they couldn't use, but they just took it for the simple reason of taking it. And so those forces gradually moved into the Burnt Hickory range of mountings, And finally, they all came together and goes over into Paulding County, in which our series will end. And the Paulding County historian would have to take up the various activities in Paulding County. However, I will mention that the next day, May 25th, there was fought at New Hope a very bloody battle. And a lot of the men who were through the Stylesboro area on the 24th never did see the dawn of the 26th. They were killed, a lot of them there at New Hope Church.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about the numbers of people that were involved? How many men went through Stylesboro? How many people?
Well, through the Stylesboro area, I would estimate the Army of the Cumberland approximately 60,000 men.
It's hard to imagine 60,000 people going through Stylesboro today in one honk. It would be kind of crowded.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Of course, the Confederate opposition, as I had mentioned, was light. They were afraid to move from behind the Etowah, uncertain as to which route General Sherman was going to take, because they would have left the flank open, and it would have been quite easily for them to have been outflanked, as was the case before.
And so, with the exception of the skirmish that occurred at Raccoon Creek, there wasn't much resistance in that area because everybody had pretty much gone on past the Etowah and were sitting on hold to see what's going to happen.
On the Confederate side, they couldn't spare the men. They simply were unable to get a force to oppose the main Federal Army.
Since we are talking about this Harley Stylesboro area, tell us a word or two about what the areas would have looked like at the time. What structures in New Harley, for example, stand that were present at the time that the Federal troops were rolling through there in 1864?
The covered bridge that is there now was not the bridge that was there during the Civil War.
But wasn't it typical?
It was typical of it. Actually, one of the Union artillery units moving through Harleyville, it was called, told his commanding officer the bridge was so rickety he didn't know whether he could get his artillery over it or not. Also at Harleyville was the Presbyterian and Baptist churches, which are still there now.
And you said Harleyville. We know it today as Harley.
Harley. It was called in the Civil War Harleyville.
Mm-hmm. Do you know about when that name was changed?
No, it was sometime after the Civil War, but I don't recall exactly what date. A lot of the names were shortened. Stylesboro and all the Civil War records is spelled Stilesborough. And of course it was, as we know it now, Stilesboro.
And Stylesboro, any way you spell it, was in fact named for William Henry Stiles.
William Henry Stiles, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Another point, like we said, we're getting a little bit out of sequence here. Well, a little bit out of our domain. I don't think we're not out of sequence.
Excuse me.
But summarize with us what happened between the crossing of the Federal forces of the Etowah River from Bartow County, went into Paulding County, and then briefly tell us what happened between then and October when we will be getting back.
Okay, just briefly, the most severe fighting was done, of course, in Paulding County on May the 25th, was fought the bloody battle at New Hope Church. Of course, the New Hope Church is still there, and the area around the church was the battle site. And about 2.5 miles northeast of New Hope Church is the bloody battlefield of Pickett's Mill. Both of those battles were Confederate victories. Actually, at New Hope, they didn't have too much of trenches to fight in. They just more or less fought in the open, but the Confederates had a battery of artillery there that took a severe toll of Union troops. And at Pickett's Mill, the Union forces were trapped in kind of a horseshoe. And they got it from Wheeler's command on one side and a center column and on the other flank. So they more or less were in a trap there. And that was a very bloody battle, and as I mentioned before, was a Confederate victory. There was a large number of Union troops killed at Pickett's Mill on the slope. And by the way, Pickett Mill now has been bought by the state, and it will be one of the most beautiful state parks, I believe, when it's fully developed in the state of Georgia. And I certainly am glad that it will be preserved for posterity.
Okay.
And from there, the fighting progressed into Cobb County, and the areas around Mud Creek and around Kennesaw Mountain and at Cheatham's Hill, which was called a Bloody Angle. And in each instance, once again, General Johnson was outflanked by superior numbers. If the Confederate Army had only had one more Army Corps, which they could have met the flank or the what we call in football the end run, then the results in the Atlanta campaign might have been far different. Anyway, they finally were forced to withdraw to the Chattahoochee River, and there at the Chattahoochee constructed extensive defensive works, and finally the command in Richmond got kind of tired of General Johnson retreating, as he had retreated some 110 miles, and there they decided to change commanders from General Joe Johnson to General John Bell Hood. And John Bell Hood had an excellent record in the Virginia campaign in command of a brigade. And I think he did an excellent job, but in commanding even a division, and certainly wasn't qualified to command the entire Confederate Army. And he fought numerous losing battles around Atlanta, including the Battle of Atlanta on the 22nd, and it's pictured very nicely in the Saccharama, at Atlanta now. And finally, on around the 1st of September, Atlanta fell. And General Hood then, to try to save what the Confederate Army they could, withdrew to Palmetto, Georgia. And from there, probably becomes very confusing to people in this area, because it was decided there that General Hood should come back over the same territory that we have just covered to try to wreck General Sherman's line of communications, that being the W&A Railroad. And remember, this was in October, and the series we have been filming transpired in May.
Right. So although we have now covered the forward movement of the Federal troops and Johnson's retreats of the Confederate forces all the way out of Bartow County now, we will see more action in Bartow County in October of 1864.
That's right, in October, on the movement of General Hood back over the same area which Johnson had moved in May.
Okay. Let's leave that as a hint as to what the next program will be about. Next week, our survey of the Civil War in Bartow County is concluded with Fred Knight as our guide. The topic, the Battle of Altoona in October of 1864. Be sure and join us. Fred Knight and I are standing in Altoona Pass. In front of us is Altoona Lake, but this road that lies behind us, on which we're standing, that runs through the Altoona Pass, has mountains of historical significance. Fred, tell us what this road meant to this area of the county, to this area of the country, prior to the Civil War. Why was this road here?
Okay, Helen, we're in what's known as the Altoona Mountains, and you've got mountains to the east and mountains to the west, and way back in the early times there was a road that came from the south to Altoona Pass. This was the easiest way to get through the mountains, through the Altoona Mountains. And you had a junction here. There was a road that went to the west and went south of the Etowah River called the Alabama Road. And that took the immigrants who were going to migrate to Alabama along that road. Then you had the old federal road for all of those who wanted to continue to go north, and it went on up through where near Cartersville is now, across the river, and then on up, say, like Fairmount and into Tennessee and farther north. And that was in the early 1800s. Then when we had the Cherokee Land Lottery in 1832, the W&A Railroad, which is known as the Western and Atlantic, the state of Georgia decided that they needed a railroad to go from what is now Atlanta to Chattanooga and connect the Atlantic Ocean with the west. Chattanooga being on the Tennessee River, then you could go by boat on to the Ohio on out west. And so the state built this railroad back in the 30s, and a lot of people came through here, came up to northwest Georgia to claim the land that they got in the Cherokee Land Lottery. So this was a crossroads, more or less.
Sort of a way station for travelers.
That's right.
Hartsfield of its day, right?
That's right.
Okay. And
also, there's one thing. This area in here was thought to have a lot of gold, and all of the lots that are in this land lots that are in this section that were drawn in the Cherokee Land Lottery are 40-acre lots because they were called gold lots. And as you get farther north or farther south, the land lots are 160-acre land lots. And there has been gold mined in this area in the Altoona Hills. There used to be an old saying, "There's gold in them thar hills." And they did find some. I've heard of people back in the 20s and the 30s, as late as 1920 and 1930s, panning for gold on Altoona Creek and its environs, bringing the gold dust into Cartersville to Young Brothers Drugstore. I've had Mr. Will Young tell me this himself. He used to run it, he and Mr. Mank Young, and they would buy the gold dust and pay whatever the going rate was. Back then it was about, it's either $16 an ounce or $32, I forget which.
Should have bought some.
Yeah, because it sells for about $300 or $400 an ounce now.
Okay. Fred, there was a battle that occurred in this area, and I think you said it occurred in October of 1864. If you would, back up a little bit, give us a little refresher as to what went on prior to the battle that occurred here of October of 64, and explain a little bit about the battle.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, the reason that there was a Battle of Altoona Pass is because it is strategically located. And to take us back a little bit and to how Altoona Pass comes into play, you have to realize that it's on the W&A Railroad that goes from Atlanta to Chattanooga. And that, in the early part of the war, was the line of communications for the South, taking supplies to the North. We were doing real well up until 1863. And the first time we were doing so well that in 1862, the Federals decided they better send somebody down here. And as most people recall, the Andrews Raiders came down to Kennesaw and stole a train and came right through this pass, heading back north, trying to disrupt the line of communications, and that was in 1862.
And how were they going to do that? How were they going to disrupt those lines of communication? What was their mission?
Well, they took the general, and they had about 23, Captain Andrews, he had about 23 spies, and they were going to burn the bridges, burn the cross ties, just completely disrupt the line of communications, and that way the supplies could not be gotten from the south to the north. And as we know, he failed in his mission because he was in hot pursuit, and his train, the general, ran out of fuel at Ringgold, and they ran to the woods and got captured, and most of them were executed shortly thereafter, some of them in Atlanta. And also in that Andrews Raiders, the first Congressional Medal of Honor was given posthumously to one of them, and I don't recall his name at this point in time. Later in the war, in the spring of 1864, you had a situation when Sherman had taken Cartersville, and he was on his way to Atlanta, and he's also going to try and defeat General Johnson. He decided not to come through Altoona Pass because as a young engineer years ago, he was familiar with Altoona Pass and the Altoona Mountains, and he knew that it would be suicide for his troops to try to come through here. So as we brought out not too long ago, he went across the Etowah and went on to New Hope and then the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, not choosing to come through here. Mm-hmm. Now we come to the Battle of Altoona Pass. After Sherman took Atlanta in July of 1864, General Hood, who had replaced Johnson, decided that
as commander of the Confederate
as commander of the Confederacy, General Hood knew that he could not take Sherman head on head. And he knew that Sherman was getting ready to do his march to the sea. So he decided the best thing to do was to circle back and come back through here doing the same things that the Andrews Raiders, who were the Federals in 1862, and was going to do to the Confederates. Now he was going to do this to General Sherman. So he brings his troops back through here, and there was a big garrison here at Altoona Pass, a Federal garrison. And so he sends his troops up here, and there was a big battle fought on October the 5th, 1864, where nearly 2,000 soldiers were killed, about 900 on the Federal side, around 860 on the side of the South. From atop the Altoona Pass, there was a big pine tree, and from that pine tree you could see Kennesaw Mountain. General Sherman was at Kennesaw Mountain, and he was signaled from this pass and from atop the pine tree that they needed reinforcements, and he sent signals by semaphore. Back then, you didn't have wireless and you didn't have a telephone. The Indians used smoke. He used flags, and he
and that's called semaphore?
Semaphore.
I'm sorry,
S-E-M-A-P-H-O-R-E. And when you're in the Boy Scouts, That's one of the things
I
you
went with
learn.
Boy
You do
Scouts.
the semaphore. You got 2 flags, and you go A, B, C, like that. Anyway, Sherman sent this message, hold the fort for I am coming. And that's an old hymn that a lot of people have heard of since that time. At any rate, Sherman got word to General Corse, C-O-R-S-E, to come and reinforce, help reinforce the pass. And General French, who represented the Confederate side, sent a message into the garrison here asking for their surrender. And the General Corse had gotten here, and French didn't even know that he had arrived. And Corse sent the message back that we're ready to start fighting when you are. And he didn't surrender, so you had a dogfall here. And what happened after this battle, Sherman's army more or less kind of followed Hood on up towards Kingston, and Hood then went on up to Nashville, and he was defeated up there at the Battle of Nashville. Sherman just sent one outfit after him, General Thomas, and then he started his march from the sea, march to the sea, General Sherman did, from Kingston on November the 12th, 1864. So it's real interesting.
Yeah. Now, Hood's mission all the way to Nashville was, correct me if I'm wrong, to more or less destroy the railroad, right? Destroy the W&A.
Yes, that's
that
what
right?
That's right. Because see, when you get to Chattanooga, the W&A runs out, but the main line then goes from Chattanooga to Nashville, and that's so. That's basically what he's trying to disrupt the lines of communication of Sherman's army.
And this was while after Sherman was already in progress to Savannah. Is that right?
Well, yes. Sherman sent Thomas just to follow.
Just to follow him.
And they had the Battle of Nashville. Then Sherman took all the rest of his troops. Some were still waiting for him in Atlanta. Some were between Kingston. Some was in Kingston. General Kilpatrick was in Cartersville, and then the rest of the troops were in Atlanta. Incidentally, General Sherman spent the night in Cartersville right around the time of this Battle of Altoona Pass in the Granger Smith home out on Granger Hill. It's the house that Dr. Don Evans presently lives in. He spent one night there.
Tell us about the Morgan house that's just on up here to our right.
Okay, there's an old antebellum home here in the pass, and it's known now as the old Goat Morgan house, and it's owned presently by Mr. and Mrs. Bo Shropshire, who live in Cartersville. But after the Battle of Altoona Pass, it was used as a hospital. And in later years, there's a gentleman by the name of Mr. Goat Morgan, who people who got a little age on them remember. This pass also had the old Dixie Highway came through this area, and it was tough to come through here in cars. And the saying goes that Goat Morgan used to make a living by slicking the roads down and getting his 2 horses and pulling the Yankees out of the ditch and getting them through the pass and charging them $5 or $10 a hit to get through here. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I've been told that.
Sounds like Altoona Pass has been giving Yankees trouble for a long time.
Yeah, that's right. He was getting back at them.
Okay.
I'm here with Gerald Cox. Gerald's family goes way back in Bartow County history, and his family, 4 generations or 5 generations back, lived in Altoona Pass, and they've owned land in that area for years. And Gerald's great-grandfather and grandfather and Gerald himself over the years has made a real fine collection of artifacts, 80% of which he tells me comes from Altoona Pass. And Gerald, how about showing us some of this as we go through it?
Well, what we're dealing with is actually 3 generations of hunting this. My grandfather, right after the Civil War, started as a young kid finding of the relics from around Altoona Pass and the country around here, and he formed quite a collection when you could just walk around and pick it up laying on the ground before everything got buried. And when the first metal detectors come out right after the World War II, he got one of the first metal detectors, and he started increasing his collection, able to find stuff that, you know, was covered up. And then right after he got his detector, his 2 sons, mainly Price Armstrong, also got a detector and started collecting it. And from the time I was 10 years old enough to follow him, I collected it. So we dealing with just about all the time since the war that anybody could have hunted it. This collection came from here in Bartow County and from Altoona Pass. We start here. This is from the pass. We've got dropped many balls and fired, and some that were melted and fired and what have you. These are round balls of the canister that was fired in the that was either grape shot fired or was busted from the shells. And it's just an assortment of what was picked up off the field. We've got, for instance, an old canteen here, cartridge box plates and bayonets, rifle straps, part of another bayonet here, and the large chunks were shrapnel from the shells that bursted. And
Gerald, could you tell us about on the wall up here about these sabers and some of this on the wall, please?
These sabers were traded for when he was a young man right after the war. That's the reason they're so new looking. And he just bartered with the old soldiers. He used to live, they used to come through the old pass right after the war and would walk the battlefields, and he had quite a collection of old guns and sabers and what have you. This particular one was found over where the lake's now backed up. This was in the water creek, and this is one that was right off the field over here at the pass. And
what is that?
That's a part of an old bridle strap in there. This particular piece here was you have to catch that. That's where you put your foot. What do you call it?
Stirrup.
Stirrup. Right. The smooth native ball was Confederate, and the one with the 3 ring were the Yankees. These particular ones here were lost and never fired. They were just dropped. A lot of them were pulled where the gun would jam and what have you, and through cold, rainy weather, the powder would get, and they'd be necessary to pull the mini ball, and they have pull marks. But these were quinine pills, about the only medicine that was available then.
Gerald, tell us about these bayonets, where they came from and when they were
Most of these bayonets were dug out of the trenches. The ones that have got rust on them were dug out of the trenches. Some of these were new, but majority of these were dug up actually out of the fort. And
we also have a lot of these spiral mini balls and smooth ones.
these
and,
were some that were dropped and fired. There's a 50 caliber, 58 caliber, and some 69 calibers were used. But I'd like to mention that these Henryalls were the first repeating rifle, and Altoona Pass was probably one of the first places ever to use a repeating rifle. And whereas one repeating rifle was just worth about 20 people with muzzle loaders, and that's one reason we wasn't able to, I feel, recapture the fort because of these repeaters. But
tell us about this with the NJ on there. What is that?
Cartridge box plates that we use. This particular would be a Yankee from New Jersey, and this was the whole ensemble lines that was worn. This was a bayonet, the cartridge cap box, and of course the buckle, and this was the cartridge box.
Gerald, this looks like a great big nugget of gold, and I know there's been a lot of gold mined in Altoona Creek, and this is the gold district. Tell us what this is. Is this gold or not gold?
Well, that's what's fooled a lot of people. A lot of people went crazy hunting it. That's a pyrite. It has the weight of gold and what have you, but it's just not gold. If that would be gold, it'd be worth a small fortune if you could find gold concentrated where you could see it like that. We'd tear the county up hunting it.
Well, I've always heard of the mining of gold in Altoona, and do you think there is some gold in Altoona Pass?
There's been gold found, and you can still to this day find enough around to at least rattle, but you'll sure put a week's work in to get it, and it's just not profitable unless we could sink some shafts maybe a mile deep under us at the fault here in the county. There may be some deep, but right on top, there's none exposed that I know of. These cannonballs that are up here were found by my grandfather and my uncle, Price Armstrong. I've got a lot more, some I found that aren't on display, but
tell us about these buttons.
These well, we've got buckles and buttons. We've got from everything, the snake buckle Confederate to the CS officer's buckle to the plain CS to the there's a CS Union buckle, and it's just assortment of them. Here we've got a watch that was dug out of a trench.
Could you tell us about these rifles here?
Well, we've got here a 58 caliber and a 69 caliber. These guns were never lost in the trenches, but they all, I guess they could be used today. They were just rifles that it's been in the family for a long time, and hey, my grandfather got us a young boy, but the camera could just scan. You just have to leave it to the imagination of what we have. It's just a good representation of anything a soldier would carry, and that could be lost. For some of the shells that were lost, and abandoned in the trenches and what have you. There's 3 or 4 different representations. There was a husky, the parrot, or standard round cannonballs, just some of them that were lost.
To our left over here is the railroad track, which at one time was a W&A railroad. Is that right?
That's right.
And then we have this grave here of an unknown hero.
Okay, where we're standing, Ellen, is we're south of Altoona Pass, looking to the north, and we're standing by the tomb of an unknown hero, and you just went around there and read what it said, and I've forgotten what it said. Would you?
He died for the cause he thought was right.
And I've always heard that we don't know whether this was a Federal or Yankee or Confederate, but just an unknown soldier that died in the Battle of Altoona Pass. And his grave was originally off to your right to the pass where the battle was fought. But when the railroad was moved about 35 or 40 years ago to go to your left, his grave was brought over here, and he was re-entombed in this position. And I noticed that that this grill work was done by the Manley Manufacturing Company of Dalton. All of us know them as the Manley Jail Works.
Who was it who brought this unknown hero to this site and keeps this grave up?
It is my understanding that as we all know, the W&A Railroad, is the Western Atlantic Railroad, is owned by the state of Georgia. And it's my understanding that the state of Georgia is the one that maintains this grave site. It probably with conjunction with the Seaboard Coastline, who leases the right-of-way.
Why do you suppose this particular hero was singled out of the many who must have died in battle at Altoona, who must have been buried around? Why was he singled out, do you suppose?
Well, I think what happened, there were 1,600 or 1,700 killed on that October the 5th of 1864, and I don't really think this particular person was singled out. I think just one at random was picked to represent all of the soldiers, both from the north and the south, that were killed on October the 5th, 1864 at Altoona Pass.
Tonight's episode of the History of Bartow County takes a look at this area's black history. In this segment, you'll hear from Mrs. Susie Wheeler and Appellate Court Judge Robert Benham. Stay tuned for the History of Bartow County.
Hi, we're with Dr. Susie Wheeler. We're standing in front of a Rosenwald school in Cassville, Georgia. Dr. Wheeler is going to be telling us more about what a Rosenwald school is. She is a graduate of this school. But let me tell you a few words about Dr. Wheeler. She's a native of Bartow County of Cassville, was for 40 years an educator in Bartow County, serving as Jean's supervisor, which, as I understand it, was like a curriculum director for the Cartersville City, Calhoun City, and Paulding County school systems, and retired in 1979 as the curriculum director for the Bartow County school systems. I think that, does that sum it up pretty well?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Now, Dr. Wheeler, if you would briefly explain to us what the Rosenwald School was and the significance of it and the history of this building behind us.
The Rosenwald School was funded by Julius Rosenwald, who had set aside some monies to be spent for building schools in the Southeast. I think most of these buildings were to be built for black people in the South, the rural South, as he called it. This particular building was built in 1923. It was named Noble Hill School. And it has here two standard classrooms, an industrial arts room, and cloak spaces for each room. It was the first building of a Rosenwald school, we think, in northwest Georgia. There were other buildings elsewhere. I don't know how many. But there were some other buildings in some other parts of the state. This was built by a standard plan. This meaning that the classrooms were of standard size. The builders followed an architectural plan that was approved by the Rosenwald Fund that at that time was administered, I still think, through the State Department of Education.
And when was it constructed again?
It was constructed in 1923.
Approximately how many students do you think would have gone through the Rosenwald School?
My goodness, I'm not sure. I think we'd have to start with supposedly 40 to 50 students per year. And it finally got, in the 50s, it became about 60 to 70 students in the school. So we'd have to do our mathematics from that point of view.
Well, all right. Help us then by letting us know. How long was the school in operation?
The school was in operation from 1923 through 1954.
Okay.
And it, at that time, the consolidated school for Bartow County was opened, I believe, in 1955.
Mm-hmm.
And the students from this school and all other elementary students in Bartow County went to this one school known then as Bartow Elementary School. Mm-hmm. That was in 1955.
All right. Prior to 1955, let's trace the educational system for blacks back a few years. I asked you a little previously about where the schools for blacks were located in this county. Could you sort of run through that for me again?
Yes, I can tell you some. I can't go quite back to all.
That's okay.
We would start at Adairsville. There was one there. There was a school at Kingston, a school at Gore Springs, a school at U Harley, one at Taylorsville, Stylesboro, Emerson, Pine Grove, Rydell off pine log, sometimes we call it, white, and then the Cassville School. I believe I've called them all.
Okay, great.
Not sure.
And these would have been primarily elementary schools?
All of
them.
those
Okay.
were elementary school. And the high school students from the county went to Summer Hill School in Cartersville. And for a long time, we only had 9 grades in that school in Cartersville, so that high school students during even my time had to go elsewhere to complete the high school education. I went to Griffin, Georgia. Cabin Creek, yes. Cabin Creek School was just a little boarding school supported by a church and an association, Baptist Association, I believe.
Okay.
Many students went elsewhere.
And so the Summerhill, the only high school in this county for blacks was the Summerhill High School, and it only went through the 9th grade?
For a number of years. And then after that, it did go to the 11th grade. I think they put on a year at a time, so that some students only went away for the 11th and the 12th year at first. And then the 11th year was added, and finally, of course, at one time, the state of Georgia only had 11 years for their high school. But when they did add the 12th year, Cartersville had the 12th year.
All right. For the benefit of maybe some of our younger viewers, why are we talking about 2 separate school systems? When we're talking about black school systems, and of course there are no such thing as black school systems anymore. When were the schools integrated?
The schools were integrated, I believe, in the early 60s. In fact, we began talking integration in the early 60s, and really integration came in full perhaps in the latter part of the 60s. I recall that in 65 there were only a few black students in what we call predominantly white schools. But segregation really ended for Bartow County, I believe, in 68. I'm not sure of that date, but somewhere along that time, 67 or 68.
All right. Okay, let's see. We're standing in front of the Friendship Baptist Church in the St. Elmo community near Adairsville. Miss Wheeler taught at a school that was located at one time behind this church. It no longer exists. But if you would, tell us a little bit about the school.
This school was at first a 2-teacher school. Later it became a 3-teacher school as we had more students in this area, in this community. It served its purpose for us until the consolidated school was built in Cassville area. After that, all the young people from here were transported to Cassville.
What years are we talking about?
I'm talking about the years beginning in 1955 upward.
Okay. And was it just by coincidence that the school and this church were located in such near proximity to each other?
No, I think in most communities you're going to find that the schools were located near the churches. They were perhaps in the lodge halls, and we had lots of lodge halls in our county where schools were located in those, or in buildings close to the church.
And there is, in fact, a lodge hall within sight of the church.
Yes.
Right here.
Yes. I'm standing on the spot of the family home of Thomas and Emma Smith. Here I played many days because I grew up here too as a child, along with many other grandchildren. This house was built by Thomas Smith for his family in the late 1890s. Only one other child in his family was born before this house was built. He was married, Thomas Smith was married to Emma Smith, and Emma Smith was the granddaughter of Charles Edwards. And as research has shown our family, Charles Edwards came to this area in 1850. He came here on a covered wagon bringing his family. And as far as we know, this was a homestead area for him. Charles Edwards was a minister, a teacher, and a landowner. We don't know how he came about this land, but he came here following the Civil War. And we think perhaps he came here with his owner at that time, who was probably finding a homestead for himself. For a long time, this particular area, which was a large pasture, was a picnic area for the community of Cassville. We had picnics, ball games, any other kind of recreation that you wanted here on the area. It was known as a Smith Recreation Center. There are 80 acres in this plot, and there is a story of one of the daughters of Charles Edwards that goes like this, that her name was Harriet Edwards, and she went with her family out of Charleston, South Carolina, to Europe. They were to return on the Titanic. And because she was a black woman, they decided that they did not want her to come on that luxurious ship. Her family decided not to come with them, so that it was known later that she saved her family, the Parsons, from the tragedy of the Titanic.
We're continuing our history of Bartow County on Channel 4, and I'm Lee Berger, your host for this segment of the program, as we discuss black history in Bartow County with Judge Robert Benham. And Robert, thank you for coming and being a part of this program, and we're finding it very interesting, and I'm sure that with the information that you have, you find it very interesting.
Thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here. I found it very interesting gathering some of this information together.
Okay. In the first part of our program, we've discussed some of the black history with Susie Wheeler, and now she had recommended that we get in touch with you and that you could follow up on some things that she had discussed and give us some new information on black history. First of all, Robert, are there any good sources for finding out about the history of blacks in Bartow County, or just blacks in general and their history?
No, Lee, I'm afraid there aren't any good sources. And when I mention good sources, I'm talking about traditional sources like the encyclopedia or county histories, although I must give Ms. Conyers credit for the excellent history she did on Bartow County. That included some of the notable black contributions, but of course it did not deal in depth with the black contributions. The problem with traditional sources is that blacks were not seen as significant contributors to history. So therefore, in gathering this information, I had to tromp through the cemeteries, the graveyards, talk to many of the elderly people in the community, look at some of the old court records, old newspaper clippings, and look at the state library and the state archives for some of the information.
Well, we've almost finished with our 13-week series on the history of Bartow County, and we're wrapping up our last few series concerning the history of Bartow County. Are there any common misconceptions about black history?
Yes, Lee, there are some misconceptions about the role of blacks in history, and that's not peculiar to Bartow County, that's peculiar to the nation as a whole. One common misconception is that blacks have no history. But if blacks do have a history, then their contributions have not been significant. And I think a kind of shakedown cruise of some of the records will show that blacks have been significant movers and shakers in the development of Bartow County and many of the surrounding areas. And that misconception causes some degree of concern to many blacks, especially youngsters. One role that history plays for youngsters is that it tells them that their forefathers have done something significant. As far as black youngsters are concerned, if they feel that they have no history, they somehow feel that they won't have a future either. And there is the real detriment.
Didn't this kind of all begin, though, and maybe it didn't, but I feel like it did, that with the writing of the novel and the TV series Roots, that people really began to look at themselves as having a history?
I think Roots provided us an opportunity to focus on the problem. Prior to the running of Roots, it was not seen as a significant problem. But long before publication of Roots, there were many organizations that concerned themselves with black history and black contributions. But Roots raised the level of consciousness of American society.
As I said a moment ago, and I was leading to the fact that we were ending our series basically with the end of the Civil War, but we need to back up a little bit and find out about any contributions blacks had made prior to the Civil War in this area in Bartow County.
I think blacks made rather significant contributions. You have to look at black contributions in the context of slavery. And you also must look at black contributions and compare the contributions in Bartow County with some other areas of the state. You will realize that in this area, because of the topography, the mountainous area, this area was not suited for farming. So therefore, slavery and plantation type slavery, as was known in central Middle Georgia, never was very prolific in this area. So those people who owned slaves owned a very small number of slaves. I think 10 would have been a high number of slaves for a family that owned in Bartow County. But because of that particular system of slavery here, blacks were more craftsmen than they were farmers as such, because that rather mirror the white population, that we had craftsmen up in this area. And of course the mountainous area is still known for the excellent craftsmanship here. And those blacks who participated in the lifestyle here were more responsible for the construction of large mansions, for many of the types of crafts that we have here. And the contributions went in that area. There was no participation whatsoever in the political arena.
Do you have any examples of any craftsmen that we, by name?
Oh, there were quite a few, and some of these predated the Civil War, continued through and were in the post-Civil War era. Take down in the U Harley community, we had the Good family. They were very accomplished in making brooms, constructing many farm implements and tools. Up in the northern part of the area, we had many people up around the White area who contributed significantly. We had many blacks who were builders, because you must understand that these were the people who were responsible for constructing the mansions that existed here. So we had stone masons, brick masons, and the like who contributed. A clear evidence of that is that in the post-Civil War era, 1883, W.W. King, who was a black contractor, was commissioned to construct the first bridge over the Etowah River, and I think some of the pillars from that bridge still remain.
Now, where is that located?
That's located north of the present bridge going between Cartersville and Emerson. But that is just an indication of the type of skills that blacks had during the pre-Civil War era and shortly after the Civil War era. So we see blacks in this instance as being significant movers and shakers into the development and construction of this county.
Well, since we're on the Civil War, what about the Civil War? Contributions from blacks during that period, of that 4 or 5 year period?
All right. In terms of the Civil War itself, very little attention was given to race relations as such, because the country was in the throes of a dilemma, that is, an armed conflict. One of the most significant contributions blacks made during the Civil War is that some 400 slaves were used to mine the saltpeter caves. And of course, saltpeter is an essential element in construction in the preparation of gunpowder. And we see many blacks who worked in that arena. But blacks were also active during the Civil War, not in combat, but in maintaining the home front as such, making sure that the plantations ran in an orderly manner, and blacks went about their normal duties. Of course, you have to understand, in North Georgia, you had no significant number of blacks in the area, although blacks did represent 1/3 of the population in Bartow County. Some counties to the north, they had no blacks whatsoever.
Now, was that due to the mining and the craftsmen, as you said, the craft?
That's right. I think you didn't have a large importation of slaves in the mountainous area because the mountainous area was not suited for a plantation-type economy. So the blacks that were brought in with families that migrated from South Carolina, and blacks played a significant role in the mining industry. Of course, you must realize that the mining industry was in its infancy at the time. And if you look at many of the pictures of the mines, almost invariably you will see black workers in those mines. And of course, we also had blacks post-Civil War who owned several mines here in Bartow County.
Do you have any names?
Oh, right. Levi Pruitt is one. Because Levi Pruitt owned the mine up north of Cartersville, right behind what is now the new industrial complex. And he had a railroad that went to his mine, because he and the Robinson family also that family worked in mining. But Levi Pruitt was an interesting fellow in that not only was he an accomplished miner, he also helped provide much of the rock that went into the construction of the old Dixie Highway leading from Tennessee south. And he also employed many other blacks in the mining industry. After, in farming, I think you call it laying by. After you laid by your crop, then many of the blacks went to work for Levi Pruitt in the mine. So he contributed significantly to the economy of the area at the time.
Are any of his relatives still here in Bartow?
That's right. Many? Several of his relatives still exist up in what is known as the Pine Grove area. The Pruitt family is still up in that area, and they still own a significant amount of land. Of course, Levi Pruitt at the time owned in excess of 500 acres of land, and you had several other large landowners who were black.
Very interesting. Let's move on to the Reconstruction period, that is right after the Civil War, and it is generally thought of as that during that time there were many blacks elected to political office or held political office during that period. Is that so in Bartow County?
No, that is not so in Bartow County. Whereas that statement is true of the South in general, it's not true of North Georgia. Blacks did not hold any significant political positions. In fact, blacks held no political positions at all. One, because of the percentage of the population, and two, because blacks were not permitted to participate in the political life of the community. So you will hear people say quite often, well, he is the first black to hold an office since Reconstruction. As far as North Georgia is concerned, it would be the first black to hold an office, period, because there were no black office holders in the Reconstruction era in Bartow County. Of course, Bartow County had to be drugged kicking and screaming into the Civil War. Bartow County, once the Civil War started, they were loyal to the South and they participated fully, but they were not chomping at the bit to join the Civil War. In fact, if you look at some of the congressional debates, many of the representatives from this area were not that anxious to join this armed rebellion, as it was considered at that time.
Who were some of the significant black leaders during the period right after the Civil War and leading up, say, to the early 1900s?
You had several families that I would call the movers and the shakers in this era. And they were movers and shakers more so in the economic arena than in the political arena. I have to preface my statement with that because you must realize that during the Civil War and prior to the Civil War, blacks were prohibited by law from reading or writing or possessing material that could be used for reading or writing. So you had not the educational background for blacks, but they were significant contributors in the economic arena. Let me give you several examples. Ben Tompkins, who maybe died at the age of 80, was very successful in organizing what was known then as burial lodges. And this particular type of lodge served in the same capacity as a welfare agency served, and that is, it took care of the needs of the downtrodden, the put upon, and the oppressed so that they would be provided for and would not become wards of the state. Of course, this was prior to the state having what we recognize now as a welfare system. But these burial lodges took care of the black community, stressed paying debts, property ownership, responsibility as heads of the household, something that was very important during that era.
Why were they called burial lodges?
Well, they were burial lodges because they were organized with that as their primary goal. You have to realize that insurance companies did not insure blacks because of the short lifespan, the high infant mortality rate. Of course, that also gave rise to the black insurance companies. But this was the only means of burial for a family or to take care of people during sick and accident. In fact, they had a sick and accident program that provided 25 cents a week if you were sick. And, of course, I looked at many of the people in the county who drew the 25 cents a week who belonged to the burial societies. Now, these societies still exist. Another significant contributor during that time was Austin Benham, who organized a burial lodge back maybe in late 1882. And this had as its purpose the burial of people who could not afford it. But this was the structure provided in the black community. We also have the Wade family. That family was composed of Ned Wade, who was considered the patriarch of the family. And this family had vast land holdings in Bartow County.
How did they get this land?
All right.
Since basically blacks weren't allowed to own land, or were they?
Blacks were not allowed to own land in the pre-Civil War era. There were arrangements made whereby land would be deeded to another person for the benefit of a person who was then a slave. Of course, you must realize a misconception is that all blacks were slaves during the pre-Civil War era. Here in Bartow County, as early as 1842, we had 22 black free people. That figure vacillated as low as 11 and as high as 25 during the pre-Civil War era. So you had blacks who were participating in the economy and in the community that did not have the status of slaves. And of course, one significant landowner was Angeline Peacock, who died in 1902, but her family owned that area of town now, extending almost from Owings Funeral Home down to the First National Bank. and she owned that particular plot of land and owned quite a lot of acreage here in Bartow County. But also you have to realize that blacks also were considered as merchants during the post-Civil War era too, because they had provided services prior to and during the Civil War, so it was just a natural that they would continue to engage in the economic life of the community after the Civil War. And the list of people will probably go on and on as to, you had Luther Sidney, who was a cobbler, very accomplished cobbler, and he was so accomplished at his trade that Warm Springs, of course, at that time dealt with polio victims, requested that he make the shoes for the people in Warm Springs because he was so accomplished at his craft. We had blacksmiths, we had wagon makers. I think that was an area in which blacks
that was very big in this area at one
That's
time.
right. Of course, you had the prairie schooners. That's a form of wagon, but blacks also worked in that area. So we have significant contributions, and I think the list will go on, and I won't give you name after name, but that's probably indicative of the type of contribution. You mentioned earlier a book that was published by the Chamber of Commerce chronicling the progress of the town in the 1880s. If you will notice in that book, it also has what's known as a colored section, right. Something similar now to the Chamber of Commerce publication. But in that section, it would list the black people, and beside each black person, it will mention his trade or skill, seamstress, and you will see that very few of the blacks were servants. Most of the blacks were craftsmen because they had a particular skill. It was a broom making, seamstering, bottoming chairs, and the list goes on and on. But that's one thing that's been beneficial to this community because the blacks hail from a craftsman-type background rather than an agrarian background that's indicative of Middle and South Georgia for many blacks.
Since we didn't have that plantation atmosphere, we also at that time had, as you said, as high as 22 free black people. What were the race relations like prior to the Civil War and say right after the Civil War?
I think the race relations now sort of mirror what they were like 100 years ago. You'll notice here in Bartow County, and I hope I'm reading the atmosphere correctly, race relations are not strained. And there is a significant reason for that. I think the people in Bartow County have always been sensitive and sympathetic to the needs of their fellow man. But because of the mounting atmosphere, master and slave did not have the same status as master and slave had in South Georgia, because there was a plantation. Slaves had separate quarters, the slave quarters, and the master had the big house. Of course, if you have only 2 or 3 slaves, it's not economically feasible to have slave quarters. And in fact, most of the blacks live very close to the whites in the community. And you will also see in the early history of this county and in the city, blacks and whites also lived on the same streets. We didn't have that many streets, and you would find a black family living here and a white family living there. The segregation only occurred to a large extent in the 1920s. But I think it was because of the close working relationship between races that they were thrown together, and the high degree of skills possessed by the blacks in the community caused for more wholesome race relations here in this county, more so than in many other counties. So I'd say to sum race relations up, race relations were wholesome, but they were under a system where the master had a position and a slave had a position. Very seldom did they vary from those positions, but they were close together. And of course, now you have to also consider the Indian influence. There was a lot of intermarriage between, or in that instance, jumping over the broom as marriage was considered, a lot of intermarriage between blacks and Indians, and also between whites and Indians. And of course, that brought for probably a more homogeneous situation. And so all of those factors went into contributing to more wholesome race relations.
How do you view the progress of blacks in the history of Bartow County?
Well,
Since you are part of that history yourself, being appointed an appellate judge.
Well, I think the progress in Bartow County as far as blacks is concerned probably outdistances that in other areas of the state. One, because of the background. Two, because of the willingness of the people in the area to come together. As far as my study of the history of this state is concerned, that you had probably three major hubs of activity. Bartow County in terms of the influence of minorities, the Griffin hub concerning the influence of minorities, and the Savannah hub, the influences in that area. And I think that's why Bartow County probably is more of a leader, and that's why I see a very bright progress for race relations in Bartow County, because the whole premise is that if you waste the human resources, that the whole reservoir of resources is somehow depleted. And I think the citizens of this county have seen and saw at an early time that if the talents of blacks are wasted, then the whole reservoir of talents in Bartow County is depleted. So a significant effort has been made to utilize the resources that exist here, both black and white.
Well, Robert, we want to thank you first of all. I shouldn't refer to you as Robert. I should refer to you as Judge Benham. We want to thank you for coming and being here on our program and taking time out from your busy schedule to do something I think you enjoyed anyway. I think you enjoyed talking about the black history of Bartow County, and we certainly appreciate you being here and doing so.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Next week, join your host, Ellen Archer, as she and several local historians recap Bartow County's history from the beginning to the end of the Civil War.
Tonight, the History of Bartow County visits with Ms. Alice Howard. Join us as Ms. Howard recounts stories told to her as a child growing up in Adairsville by Civil War veterans and others whose memory of that tragic time were still fresh. Hello. We're in the home of Miss Alice Howard. Miss Howard is an historian, an author, a native of Bartow County, specifically of Adairsville.
Yes.
And her area of expertise is on the history of Adairsville. Miss Howard, how was it that your family came to the Adairsville area?
Well, you may know that the railroad was being built from Atlanta to Chattanooga. And they were building from Chattanooga toward Adairsville. They were to meet at Adairsville. That was exactly halfway between Atlanta and Chattanooga. So they put a turntable in Adairsville and a shop. The railroad did. And of course that was a great center of interest because people went in there to get work. They were working on the railroad. And it was a boom town. And houses were being built and people moving in there. And of course, my grandmother's family at that time was they were breaking up because my great-grandfather had died, and the estate was sold and divided among the 9 children. And my grandmother was not married, and nor her sister, Elizabeth, were not. In fact, none of them. They were young people, just in the early 20s. Maybe, and of course, my grandmother was just 15, and her sister was probably 17. And they all came to Adairsville to invest their money there. And that is the reason a lot of people came. And my grandmother was the daughter of Zachariah Goldston, who had this huge plantation where Avondale now sits. And when he died, of course, his estate was broken up, and my grandmother brought her 2 personal slaves with her when she came to Adairsville. And they lived until I was 17 years old. And their names were Jim and Emma Goldston. And I was so glad that I knew them. But that so many families did that. They came there to get work and to buy property and live, make their living there.
Yes, I believe you told me earlier that it was your grandmother, Nancy Goldston, that is the reason that you became interested in the history.
Well, my grandmother married Ebenezer Lovelace, and her sister married James Lovelace, and her brother married Martha Lovelace, all of the same family. And so, of course, they established homes there. And my Uncle Gilbert Goldston went in business. He had a store there. And they all just fell right into trying to make a livable place and do something for the city, for the town. And that's what they did. Mm-hmm. And of course, when my grandmother's husband went to war, he left her there with 3 little children. But they had the only really elegant home in Adairsville. There were 2. There was one up on Main Street that's still there. And I wish to goodness that they had not torn down my grandmother's house, because it was really a remarkable, lovely place.
What would it? What would be near where your grandmother's home was?
Well, it was. If you know the town, as you come in from Cartersville, if you come to the cemetery, come right in front of the cemetery, the street that runs in front of the cemetery. It's at the corner, right opposite the stores.
Okay.
And it was right in the heart of town. And that was where she lived during the war. And that's where the Yankees came and looted her home. And of course, the little, wasn't any battle in Adairsville, but there were shells dropped on the town. And there was a battle just north of Adairsville in a wheat field up there. There was a little battle there.
Near the Octagon House.
Oh, yes, it was. And of course, they burned the Octagon House to get the Confederates out of it. You knew that. They were in this Octagon House. They were shooting the Federals, and they couldn't get them out. So they just set fire to it.
Was there any other specific, I think I've been told that that around the depot in Adairsville, that there was a little fighting done. And there's a story that was related to us earlier in the series of two Confederate soldiers, two unknown Confederate soldiers having been killed and buried near the
You didn't know
depot.
that story?
And I want you to, let's hear it again.
Well, of course, you know, I heard that all my life. And I was so interested in it. I mean, it really bothered me that those two boys were buried there. Nobody knew who they were. And they had died away from their homes, and their people didn't know what became of them. And I thought it was so sad. And I would run away across the street, clear across the lot, and the railroad, and go down there and stand at the graves and think about those boys. And that followed me all my life. We decorated the graves. Even after I was grown and married, everybody had forgotten it. And I would write about that in the paper once in a while, trying to get people interested. I wanted those graves moved because it was a terrible place right by the railroad. It was in a bog, and it was grown up with weeds and saplings. But I'd take the Boy Scouts and go down there and clean off the grave on Memorial Day, and I'd make a wreath and out of magnolia leaves, red, white, and blue ribbon. And we'd have a little ceremony. But I was the only one that cared anything about it. And when I'd write about it, somebody'd meet me on the street and say, "Aunt George, your column this week." But nobody did a thing about it. So when I found out who they were, and of course that was through a seance, and I didn't believe in seances at all, but I was invited to see one. Did you know that?
I learned this from the horse's mouth, though. Yes, I heard it.
So I went over. I said, yes, I'd like to see it. And I went over to McCutcheon's, and she and her sisters, her daughters and her sister-in-law sat down at the table and put their hands on the table. And that table started moving, and I thought it was funny. So I sort of giggled, and they didn't like it. But when it went on, I saw they had nothing to do with it. They could not have done, because that table rose up from the floor by itself. And it walked around the room, and it did things that was frightening. But they got some very strange messages. So the next night, I told my mother and stepfather about it. Mama said, well, that couldn't happen at my house. I don't believe in it, and it wouldn't happen here. It could happen at Lena's house, of course. And my stepfather says, well, now, wait a minute. I saw that when I was a boy at my own home. And I don't know what it is, but it will work. And he called me Top. He said, Top, get the table. Let's see if it'll work in Ellen's house. And we sat down at the table, and the minute they put their hands on it, it started to do the same thing it had done over there. And Mama said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. So she got up. He said, sit right down. You're the one that doubted it. You're going to sit and see it. She was the first one got a message. She got 2 messages right away, and one of them made her turn pale. And so it went on, and she asked me to call the McCutcheons and the Bishops, their friends. And of course my nephew stopped by, and some friends saw the cars and the lights all over the house, and they stopped by to see what was going on. And the room was full of people. When we got this message, it was after 12 o'clock, and it came along. And it was from Jack Kirby. And I asked around the room if anybody knew of Jack Kirby. They did not. And so I asked the table, I said, have you ever been in Adairsville? The table shook yes. When? May 1864. And I said, what is your message? And it was this. My comrade and I was shot from the tree down by the railroad and were buried where we fell. I said, who was your comrade? T.W. Farrer. Where were you from? Norfolk, Virginia. I said, now we know. Now we know. And we just quit. But I came to Atlanta a couple of weeks after that and went to see Wilbur Kurtz, well-known historian. I'd done some research for him. And I usually went by to see him when I had time. And of course, we always talked about the Civil War. He said, Miss Howard, those boys, those graves ought to be moved to the cemetery. Had anybody done anything about it? I said, nobody's done anything about it, but I've written about it many times. And he said, well, it just simply should be done. I said, well, I know who they are now. He said, well, how in the world did you find out 110 years afterwards? I said, well, if I tell you, you'll either laugh or you won't believe me. He says, you know I believe you. And I told him. And he said, well, you can verify it. I said, how? He told me where to write. And I sent their names. And I got the information. Their military record. And then I was told that I could get the stones. The government would send the headstones. Well, it all worked out. And I decided I had to have a commemoration service after they were moved. I knew I couldn't do it. It was too expensive. But I asked the cemetery, I found 2 lots, 2 places they could be buried. And I asked them to give them to me, and they did. And I asked the undertaker if he would do the digging, and he did. Mm-hmm. And so we got it all set up, and I invited everybody, the senator, the representative, the governor, and Franklin Garrett, and Colonel Bogle, and everybody of importance I knew, and they came. And we had the ceremony.
Mm-hmm. So they do now lie in the Adairsville Cemetery. You told me earlier about the stories that you heard as a young girl.
Yes.
And
well, my grandmother would talk to these old veterans that came back. I knew every man who had been in the war and came home. And the cemetery, when we got interested in this, I went to the cemetery and I located every one of them. And do you know, only 2 or 3 had any mention of their being a veteran of the Civil War. And I said, well, here lies a man that fought in the Civil War, and it's not even on his gravestone. And most of them were that way. So I identified them and sent their names to Washington and got markers for them.
Well, good for you. Approximately how many would there be in the Adairsville Cemetery?
Well, I think there were about somewhere between 15 and 20 that I knew. And I came across an old picture of a meeting. Dr. Biden got the veterans together at the Methodist Church, and he had a speaker who had been chaplain in the war. And of course I was there. I was always everywhere. There'd been anything going on, and I was there. And they made a picture in front of the church. And years, I guess 50 years afterwards, I came across that picture and identified every man on it. And I was the only person that could do it. Nobody else knew.
You must have heard hundreds of war stories, or what's your favorite one, or what's one you would relate to us?
Well, really, the one that I was just a little girl, and you know, children like to hear anything repeated.
Right.
And we would walk I would walk to town with her to do her shopping. And we'd pass her home. And there was a walnut tree on the corner of her lot. And I called it the hanging tree because they were about to hang a boy who was retarded. And the Yankees thought he was putting on an act that he was a spy. And my grandmother looked out her window and saw what was happening. They had a rope around this boy's neck. And she called them out of the window and told them to leave that boy alone. And they didn't pay any attention. They laughed at her. So she marched herself down. She weighed about 100 pounds and wasn't as tall as I am. And she flew down there and told those men to take that rope off that boy. He was retarded and he was not a spy, and for them to let him alone. She knew the family, and that she would report him to the general, them to the general, if they didn't do what she told them to. Well, anyway, they let him go. So she told the boy, go home and stay. Don't come back while the Yankees are here. So he went off and never did come back. But she knew all about the family and knew the boy. But that was a hanging tree. And every time we passed that, she'd have to tell me about how she talked to these soldiers and made them mind her.
Is the tree still there by any chance?
No, the tree's gone.
The tree's gone. That's too bad.
It's all gone. But, and then of course about the two soldiers. Mm-hmm. That was constantly on my mind. And it stayed that way all until, well, even after I found out about it. It took some time to get this going. Mm-hmm. That's what I wanted to do. And it was really a wonderful occasion. But for the commemoration, I invited all these people, and I asked my friend Ben Fortson, the Secretary of State, if he'd be the main speaker. And our representative was one of the speakers, and also Franklin Garrett and Colonel Bogle. And we held the program in the little chapel on top of the hill at the cemetery. And people were packed in it like sardines. They came mostly from Atlanta, Cartersville, and Rome, because it was never in the newspaper, anything about it. I had called the newspaper and told them the plans, but they were mad at me, so they didn't let it be known in Adairsville, and nobody in Adairsville knew what was going on, except my friends in the DAR. So anyway, it was a beautiful occasion, and we went to the club, the San Sousa Club, for the reception that they were giving for my birthday and for the out-of-town visitors. And it was packed with people. And I never did get to see the beautiful refreshment table. But they had my birthday cake there. I did get to see that. It was on the other table. But the Atlanta Journal sent a photographer, and the Atlanta and the Chattanooga Times and the Rome paper. It was all in the papers that night, and so it was quite an occasion. And I guess about the biggest thing that was ever in Adairsville. And people came from Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia. It would just surprise me. I mean, it got around. From the Rome paper, I had a friend over there that was very interested, Roger Aycock. And he got the story in his paper, and it was picked up by the Associated Press and the other news people. And it was all over the United States, and I got letters from everywhere about it, from Massachusetts to Washington, California, and Texas and Michigan. I don't know where. I had so many letters I couldn't get them in my scrapbook.
Your grandmother must have related to you some of her experiences during the war.
Well,
I know that the women weren't treated very well by the Yankees during the occupation. Are there
Well, my grandmother, when the first shell fell, it close to her, it was on the Bowden property, which was next door. And the children, little children, were all out in the yard, and they came in screaming. It frightened them to death. And so she tried to quiet them. Maybe there wouldn't be any more shells, but the next one fell on her lawn. And she, at that moment, she had been making pies. She had been to Marsteller Springs and bought eggs and butter and flour and things. That was the only place you could get anything then. And she and her sister had ridden bareback, an old swayback horse, out there to get something to make the pies with. And she was making, and when the second shell fell, she was going to take her daughters over to her sister who lived on that same street, but way out toward the cemetery. And so she took off her saw dress, and she had her money belt. She had changed everything she had into Confederate money except $200 in gold. And she put that in a belt that she wore around her. Well, she took it off. She decided she better change her, they didn't call them slips in those days, her chemise. And she hung the belt on the back of a chair, and a second shell fell, and she hastily put on her dress and left the money belt. And when she got back, her house had been looted. Her silver had been stolen, her pillows, her blankets, her quilts, everything that wasn't nailed down or red hot, she said, was taken out of the house. She had managed to have a ham in the kitchen, and it was stolen. She had hidden a bacon behind the, what do you call it? The board that runs around at the bottom. The baseboard. and they even found that. Well, she threatened to kill. She came in time to see him about to walk out with this piece of bacon, and she picked up an old bayonet that she used for poker, and she hemmed him up against the wall, and she said, "Drop the meat, or I'll kill you." And he didn't believe her. He laughed at her, and she was about to do it, and he dropped the meat and ran. But she wasn't afraid of anybody.
Doesn't sound like it. That wasn't the last time that she had problems.
Oh no,
with Yankees
no,
either, was it?
she had plenty of problems. They did. She went to the commandant. I don't know what rating he had, but anyway, somebody was there. And she found the right man, and she told him what had happened to her house. And he said, well, nothing else would, because he'd put guards, and he did put guards around the house. But everything that she needed was gone.
What did Adairsville look like? What was during those days?
Well,
as your
there
grandmother
were
explained?
a number of houses built, and there were a little row of stores that faced the railroad track. And they have been replaced, of course, by better buildings. And in fact, my grandfather, George Oliver Reed, had a what he called a confectionery store. next door to the drugstore. The drugstore was the nicest building in town, and it was Dr. Baden, Dr. J.D. Baden, owned it and he had a partner that was Mr. Henry Johnson, who was the prescriptionist. He was the, what you call it?
Pharmacist.
The pharmacist. Well, I don't talk very well in the morning. Now, if you'd gotten me about 7 o'clock
I know,
at night.
I'd already been told that. J.B. told me that you really didn't care for me.
But
Not a morning person.
I'm not
sorry,
a morning
but
person.
Thank you for having us, though, in the middle of the day.
But anyway, that is just, it had some little wooden stores, and they were built up. I remember this, that some of them were still there, you know, when I was a child. And they had about 4 or 5 steps up to the front door. But when the new stores were built, they were put down level. I don't know why they had step-ups, but that's what they did.
Well, are any of the storefronts that now stand in downtown Adairsville?
And not any.
None of them.
No.
You know, there's two things about the Adairsville I want to remember to ask. One being, where was the gun factory located?
Well, the gun factory, my grandmother showed me the site of the gun factory. It was up Main Street, and you know where it's called Beach Home, but I think an Adcock lives in it now. It was in front of the Beach Home, and she pointed that out to me several times. And of course, you know, when they got the word that Sherman was on the way, of course they left, and they went to Dawson down in South Georgia somewhere.
And another thing I've never known what is the brick building that stands on, is it 140 that crosses 41 and goes towards Rome?
You mean that looks like a...
It looks like an old jailhouse or fort or something.
Well,
what is that?
I don't think I ought to say this.
Oh, okay. Well, please do. I think it's going to be interesting.
Well, it was built by J.M. Veach. And J.M. had a store, a commissary, I guess, because he furnished, you know, they owned so much land. They had tenant farmers. And he built that at the beginning of World War II. And of course, people going to talk. And the thing that they told about it that was where he put his contraband materials that he sold under the counter.
Oh, I see. Getting back to your grandmother, you told me a pretty interesting story of a hardship that she had. This is, once again, we're kind of getting out of the Civil War period, but this is okay. The misfortune that she had after the war.
Yes, the man who was so nice and was going to look after her property because he knew how she was reared. And what she got back was a little 4-room house. And that's why she had to take her children, because her home had been, he had sold it to somebody else. She had nothing left but that little 4-room house. And no way to make any money. And do you know, I cry about it every time I think of it. The only way she could find to make any money, she dressed chickens for the Kimball House in Atlanta and put them on the train. And her little girls helped pick those chickens.
One more thing I want to ask you about is the Hamilton Fitton Gaines home in Adairsville that sits off Highway 49.
Well, it's a crime what happened to that. I went up there several times, but not lately, not since the roof is off. It was beginning to leak when I was there. But the woodwork in that place was perfectly beautiful. The hall through that house was as wide as a living room. But the drawing room itself was perfectly beautiful, and they all had beautiful ceilings, the ones across the front. And the garden was laid off so beautifully. And I could trace all the plan of the garden the last time I was there. Of course, it had grown up, and a lot of it had been ruined. But you could see it. If you knew anything about plantings, you could see. And back of it, Charles Hamilton had a racetrack, which was not a copy of anything that. This house was a replica of General Sandy Allen's home.
And tell us how it was that Charles Hamilton came to build a home in Bartow County that would be a
Well, they owned the property there, the Hamiltons did, and he was captured during the war of the Texas-Mexico War, and he was incarcerated in Sandy Allen's home, and which was they became friends, and so of course he was just fascinated by this house, and it was exact replica that he built with the wine cellar and everything. It was really a beautiful place. I guess it was the handsomest place in North Georgia, except for Barnsley. Barnsley had the finest place, but this was next to it, and they were entirely different.
And where did Charles Hamilton come from? Do you know where was his?
I know that it was a very prominent and wealthy family, and Colonel Telemann Cuyler was related to him, and he was the one who told me the name of it. They called it Thistledale. Charles Hamilton did. But when the Gaineses bought it, they changed the name to Belmont. And Gaineses live there. And
they still own it?
They still own it. They have let it absolutely deteriorate.
Mrs. Howard, I appreciate your having us. And once again,
Well,
especially in the morning.
I wish I could have done better.
No, you've done a wonderful job and made our
Well,
series
come back
much richer for
sometime at night.
I will. I'd love to. I'd love to.
I talk better.
Okay. Thank you. And thus concludes Channel 4's treatment of the history of our county from the mound builders through the Civil War. We've enjoyed it and hope you have. Finally, we extend our most sincere appreciation to all who have shared their knowledge, homes, and time to make this series possible. And to you, our viewers, thank you.
If you have an interest in the history of Bartow County, the Etowah Valley Historical Society has available to the public this beautiful book entitled Historic Bartow County, 1828 to 1866. This book is filled with pictures of historic landmarks and homes that tell the story of our heritage. If you'd like a copy of this beautiful book, please send a $26 check payable to the Etowah Valley Historical Society, Post Office Box 886, Cartersville, Georgia.